A black woman with an unmistakable accent is stopped by two police officers during a routine traffic stop. The officers, assuming she's just another random civilian, begin mocking her accent and making snide remarks. They laugh, believing they can get away with it. But little do they know, this woman isn't just anyone. She's a UN ambassador, one of the most powerful women in the world. When the truth comes to light, their mocking quickly turns to shock, regret, and embarrassment. What happens next will leave these officers speechless and change everything. It was a warm afternoon when the woman, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, drove down a busy city street. The sun streamed through the trees lining the road, and the light was just starting to soften as evening approached. Her car, a modest but well-kept vehicle, hummed steadily along the road. She was focused on getting to an important meeting, but didn't feel rushed. Everything seemed calm, until she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. With a slight sigh, she signaled and pulled over to the curb, her calm demeanor in contrast to the growing tension she felt from the police car behind her. She had nothing to worry about. The traffic stop was routine, at least it should have been. The officers emerged from the police vehicle with a sense of authority that was more noticeable than necessary. The taller officer walked confidently toward her car, his facial expression unreadable. His partner, shorter and younger, trailed behind, looking slightly more relaxed. The woman rolled down her window, offering a polite smile, expecting the usual exchange. "Good afternoon, officers," she said. The taller officer looked down at her, scrutinizing her for a moment before speaking in a clipped tone. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, officer," she responded calmly. "I'm not sure why." Without missing a beat, the younger officer, standing just behind his partner, spoke up with a smirk. "Must be a misunderstanding. I don't know what you're doing driving through here with an accent like that. Where are you from, anyway?" The taller officer joined in, both of them now looking down at her as if she didn't belong. "You don't look like you're from around here. This neighborhood's not really for people like you, you know." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her voice level, refusing to let their mockery get under her skin. She could feel the tension building, but she didn't show it. What they didn't know was that they had just underestimated the person sitting in front of them. The woman, though taken aback by the officer's words, remained poised. The subtle sting of their dismissive tone wasn't lost on her, but she knew she needed to stay composed. These kinds of moments were unfortunately all too familiar. Yet she could sense that this time was different. These officers hadn't realized who they were dealing with. The taller officer, still standing outside her window, leaned slightly closer, his body language casual but condescending. "So, what brings you to this part of town?" he asked, his words laced with an unspoken assumption that she didn't belong in the area. He glanced at her accent once more, as if it was the only thing that mattered about her. "I'm just on my way to a meeting," she replied smoothly, maintaining eye contact, trying to diffuse the situation. "But that's no reason to treat me like I'm out of place." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by her calm response. "Oh, I'm sure," he said sarcastically. "A meeting, huh? Where's that at?" Before she could respond, the younger officer piped up, mocking her accent with a laugh. "Yeah, what kind of meeting could someone like you be going to?" He seemed to think his words were harmless, but the undercurrent of racism was unmistakable. The woman's patience was starting to wear thin, but she still refused to give them the satisfaction of an angry outburst. Instead, she straightened in her seat and took a deep breath. "I think we're both aware of what's happening here," she said evenly, her voice no longer light but firm. "I'm being judged because of how I speak and where you assume I'm from. I'm not asking for special treatment, just respect." The younger officer laughed, clearly amused by his own mockery. He looked at his partner, and they exchanged a quick, approving glance, as if the woman's response was insignificant. They couldn't have been more wrong. "You don't know who you're talking to," the woman said, her voice steady but full of meaning. Her words weren't just about the officers or this interaction. They were about everything that had led her to this moment, about all the countless times people like her had been dismissed or belittled. But they didn't know who she was. And now it was time to change that. She paused for a moment before speaking again. "I'm a UN ambassador," she said quietly, each word measured but carrying an undeniable weight. "I'm here on official business, representing my country and my people." The two officers froze, the smugness that had once been evident in their faces instantly slipping away. The taller officer's mouth went slightly agape, his expression shifting from arrogance to genuine shock. The younger officer, who had been grinning a moment before, looked utterly confused. He glanced nervously at his partner, unsure of how to respond. The woman, still sitting comfortably in her car, remained silent for a few moments, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. She could feel their discomfort now, and it was satisfying, but she wasn't done. "I may not fit the picture you had in your head about what a UN ambassador looks like," she continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "But I assure you, I've earned that title. And you've just disrespected someone who represents not just my country, but people all over the world who are treated like I've been treated today." The officers exchanged glances, the realization slowly sinking in. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, while the senior officer straightened his posture, now clearly embarrassed. It was clear they had no idea how to handle the situation they had just created. "I'm not here to make a scene, but I won't stand for being treated this way," she said. "I'm going to ensure that what happened here today gets addressed. No one should be mocked or belittled because of how they speak, where they come from, or what they look like. Especially not by people who are supposed to serve and protect." There was a pause, and for the first time the officer seemed genuinely uncertain of how to proceed. The younger officer opened his mouth as though to speak but faltered, unsure of how to apologize or even what to say. The senior officer seemed to scramble for words, but none came. The authority they had once projected was now gone, replaced with a painful silence. "I suggest you take a moment to rethink your actions, officers," she said, her voice unshaken. "And I'll be following up with your department to make sure that this doesn't happen again." The woman, though still calm and collected, knew that her actions were speaking louder than anything else in the moment. She wasn't just asserting her authority, but challenging the officers' preconceived notions. It was clear they had underestimated her. Now, they had no choice but to face the consequences. As the woman prepared to drive away, she looked at the officers one last time. "Have a good day, gentlemen," she said, her voice sharp and composed. "But remember, respect should never be conditional." The officers stood there, silent and stunned, watching her drive away. The woman's calm yet firm demeanor had completely shifted the power dynamic, and they were left to reflect on their own actions. The woman drove off slowly, her hands on the wheel steady. Despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins, she hadn't just been mocked or belittled by two officers who saw her as nothing more than another black woman with an accent. They had underestimated her. She had stood firm and composed, refusing to let their assumptions shape how she was treated. As she made her way down the road, she couldn't help but reflect on what had just transpired. This wasn't about one woman's dignity being violated. It was about the larger, deeper issue of racism, that still ran through the veins of society. And today, she had turned the tables. It wasn't about using her position as a weapon. It was about reminding those in power that no one, regardless of who they are, should ever be judged based on their appearance or assumptions. Back at the scene, the two officers were still standing on the side of the road. They were speechless. The younger officer, who had been so quick to mock her, was the first to break the silence. "Did she just say she was a UN ambassador?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His partner didn't respond immediately. He was still trying to process what had just happened. In a moment of arrogance, he had treated someone with disdain, only to find out she was a woman of immense authority. Someone who could have easily brought the weight of the UN down upon him and his department with a single phone call. The realization began to hit him, and it wasn't a pleasant one. "Yeah," the senior officer finally muttered, rubbing his hand through his hair. She wasn't lying." He seemed almost defeated, as though the consequences of his actions were already weighing on him. They had made a mistake, a big one, and they knew it. But the consequences of that mistake had yet to be fully realized. They stood there in awkward silence, watching as the woman's car disappeared down the road, knowing that the impact of this interaction would not be over any time soon. The next day, the woman was in her office at the United Nations, reviewing documents for an upcoming meeting, when she received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID displayed the local police department's number. She answered promptly, but her mind was already anticipating what the call would be about. "Good afternoon. This is Officer James from the City Police Department. I'm calling to apologize for the incident that took place yesterday. We deeply regret the way you were treated, and we'd like to assure you that we are addressing this internally," the officer began, his voice earnest, but still carrying a hint of embarrassment. The woman remained composed on the other end of the line. She knew this call was coming. An apology was inevitable, given how quickly the situation had escalated. What mattered now was what the department was willing to do next. "I appreciate the apology, Officer James," she responded, her tone cool and professional. "But an apology isn't enough. What you and your colleagues need to understand is that you treated me as if I didn't matter, simply because of my appearance and accent. The consequences of that are bigger than just one exchange. This is about systemic issues within your department that need to be addressed." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a soft sigh. "You're absolutely right," the officer admitted. "We've already begun an internal review of the officers involved, and we're committed to ensuring that all our personnel receive proper sensitivity and diversity training. I assure you, we don't take this lightly." "Good," the woman said firmly. "This cannot just be a lesson learned for a few individuals. Your department needs to be held accountable for its actions, and that starts with changing the culture within. I want to see real reform, not just a few apologies." The officer agreed, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, the call ended. But the woman knew that this was just the beginning. She wasn't just going to let this moment slip away into nothing. She would follow up with the police department, with the local government, and with anyone who needed to hear her message. That no one should be judged based on stereotypes. That respect should be given to everyone regardless of who they are or where they come from. In the coming days, the incident was picked up by local news outlets. The video, which had been taken by a bystander during the confrontation, went viral. It didn't take long for the public to rally behind the woman. Social media exploded with support, and the hashtag #respect is a basic right began trending. People from all over the world shared their own stories of being discriminated against based on assumptions, their accents, their appearances, or their backgrounds. The conversation that the woman had started quickly became a global discussion. The officer's mockery, once isolated and unseen, was now an example of a broader issue that needed to be addressed. The police department, now under intense public pressure, was forced to take action. They announced that they would be partnering with advocacy groups to implement a more inclusive and accountable approach to policing. The woman, while satisfied with the steps being taken, knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight, but she was determined to see it through. She had stood up against injustice, not by shouting or raising her voice in anger, but by calmly asserting her rights and refusing to let herself be demeaned. It wasn't just her dignity she had defended. It was the dignity of every person who had ever been mistreated for the way they spoke, looked, or were perceived. As for the two officers involved, their once impenetrable confidence was now shattered. They had not only been exposed for their racism, but had been forced to confront the damaging consequences of their assumptions. Their position of power had crumbled the moment they disrespected the wrong person. The woman had made it clear respect isn't given because of title, wealth, or status. It is a right that should be granted to everyone, no matter who they are. The video of the encounter, where the officers mock the woman's accent and treat her with blatant disrespect, had gone viral. It didn't take long before it became a national talking point, sparking intense discussions about racial bias, systemic discrimination, and the abuse of power. The woman's composure during the confrontation, as well as her calm but powerful reveal that she was a UN ambassador, made the incident even more powerful. People from all walks of life stood behind her, applauding her for how she handled the situation. As the video spread across social media, it wasn't just her supporters who took notice. The police department did as well. The internal investigation into the officers' actions was swift, but the revelation that they had mocked a UN ambassador was just the beginning of a much larger issue. News outlets were now reporting that this wasn't an isolated incident. The officers involved had previous complaints against them for similar behavior, targeting people they deemed out of place. The public outcry intensified as more information came to light. The officers, once seen as symbols of authority, were now under intense scrutiny. The department quickly announced that an external review would be conducted into the culture of racism and bias within the force. The pressure from the community, advocacy groups, and social media had become too loud to ignore. The department couldn't simply sweep this under the rug. The incident had become a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement's treatment of people based on race. The police chief, who initially attempted to downplay the incident, now found himself at the center of a public relations nightmare. The woman, whose dignified stance had forced the officers to acknowledge their wrongdoings, became a symbol of empowerment for marginalized communities. Her calm and measured response to being ridiculed turned into a larger conversation about how Black individuals, particularly women, are often subject to both overt and subtle forms of discrimination. In the coming days, the woman received countless messages from people who had experienced similar treatment. They shared their stories of being stereotyped, ridiculed, or dismissed based on their accent, skin color, or background. These stories flooded her social media inbox, some even reaching mainstream news outlets. The viral video had sparked not just a conversation but a movement that demanded respect for all people, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. Her story inspired leaders and activists across the globe to push for stronger policies in law enforcement. particularly when it came to racial profiling and bias training. The fact that a UN ambassador, someone with power and influence, could be treated this way by the very people who were supposed to protect her highlighted the systemic flaws within policing worldwide. The incident showed that even those in positions of power weren't immune to the injustices that everyday people faced. The woman, who had initially wanted to handle the situation quietly, now found herself at the forefront of a global conversation about race and justice. She was invited to speak on national talk shows, participate in public forums, and even meet with legislators. But despite the media frenzy, she remained humble. Her goal wasn't personal gain or fame. It was about using this moment to create lasting change. But the twist came when, just a few days after the incident, the officers involved were placed on administrative leave. The police department's investigation had uncovered a troubling pattern of behavior. Officers with similar complaints had been overlooked or excused in the past. But now, with the public's eyes on them, the department couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. This wasn't just about a single officer's bad judgment. It was about a deeply ingrained culture of racial bias that was finally being forced into the light. The younger officer, who had mocked the woman's accent, issued a public apology. But the sincerity of his apology was questioned by many. Some felt it was too little, too late. The senior officer, who had joined in the mockery, was more reluctant to speak out. His discomfort with the situation was clear, but the weight of the public backlash was undeniable. The police department now found itself in a difficult position. Would they stand by their officers, or would they do the right thing? As the days went by, the woman's message remained unchanged. This wasn't about the officers' individual actions. It was about the larger systemic problem of racial profiling and the biases that taint the judgment of law enforcement officers. She had stood up for herself, not out of anger, but out of a commitment to make sure this kind of treatment never happened again. Her calm, dignified response had forced a broken system to confront its flaws. She also used the moment to highlight the importance of allyship. She spoke about how important it was for others to stand up, not just when they themselves were affected, but when they saw injustice happening to others. She called on everyone to use their voices to demand accountability and fairness for all. The video of the incident, now viewed millions of times, continued to be shared, discussed, and analyzed. It had sparked a movement that reached far beyond the woman's interaction with the officers. The backlash against the police department was only growing, and people everywhere were demanding real, lasting reform. The woman had become a catalyst for change, and her story was proving that one moment of resistance could create a ripple effect that changed the course of a much larger conversation. The aftermath of the viral video and the public's overwhelming support for the black woman, who had been mocked by the police officers, was nothing short of transformative. As the conversation spread across social media and news outlets, the police department found itself under immense pressure to act. The officers involved in the incident were placed under review, and the city's law enforcement agency began the long process of addressing its issues with bias and racism. The woman, however, didn't want to dwell on the personal victory of exposing the officers' biases. While she acknowledged the importance of what had happened, she used the opportunity to call attention to the larger systemic issues that had led to this encounter. She had not only held the officers accountable for their actions, but had used her platform to push for structural change, an essential step in ensuring no one else would face the same mistreatment she had. Within a few days of the incident, the police chief issued a public statement. The department announced it was launching an independent external review of its officers' behavior especially when it came to dealing with people of color. The chief also committed to working with advocacy groups and community leaders to create more inclusive and culturally sensitive training programs aimed at reducing racial biases within the police force. This was a monumental step forward for the department, but the woman knew that these actions alone wouldn't be enough. The culture needed to shift, and it needed to happen from the inside out. The woman also decided to meet with city leaders, local organizations, and law enforcement experts to discuss long-term solutions to police misconduct and racial profiling. She wasn't just interested in receiving apologies. She wanted lasting reforms that would protect all citizens, especially Black and marginalized communities, from racial bias. Her efforts resulted in the establishment of a task force aimed at improving community police relations, and she was invited to be part of it. As a UN ambassador, she had been advocating for human rights and dignity globally, but now she had an even more personal stake in these issues. Her actions had shifted the narrative, and the ripples of change were beginning to spread. While the public apology from the police officers involved was seen as necessary, many felt that it was too little, too late. The officers were eventually placed on administrative leave and underwent sensitivity training, but their reputations had been permanently tarnished by their actions. They were no longer viewed as authoritative figures. Instead, they were reminders of the biases that still festered within law enforcement. The public knew that the work wasn't over. The officers' individual consequences didn't fix the larger problem. The woman had opened the door to a necessary discussion, but it was up to the community and those in power to walk through it and ensure real change. The woman's response to the situation had been powerful, not just because of who she was, but because of how she handled it. She had faced racism and mockery head-on, not with anger or violence, but with grace and dignity. Her strength was rooted in her unwavering commitment to fairness and equality. She had refused to back down when she was disrespected, and instead stood tall in her truth, refusing to let others define her based on their assumptions. As the story continued to circulate in the media, many people expressed their admiration for how she had handled herself. In interviews and public statements, she explained that standing up against injustice didn't require anger. It required the courage to speak up, to assert your worth, and to demand that others see you for who you truly are. "I didn't stand up because I'm special," she said in one interview. "I stood up because no one should be treated the way I was treated. No one. And if we continue to let things like this slide, then we're allowing a broken system to keep hurting people." Her words resonated deeply with people of all backgrounds, and soon her story became an inspiration for others who had felt invisible or marginalized. Her quiet strength, her ability to remain calm despite being disrespected, and her commitment to fairness made her a role model. Her story became a source of empowerment for those who had been unfairly judged or mistreated because of their accent, appearance, or race. The conversation about racism in law enforcement, though sparked by this one interaction, grew into a broader movement. People from all over the world shared their own experiences, rallying behind the idea that bias, even in small forms, cannot be allowed to continue. The incident was not just about one woman. It was about showing the world that the fight for equality isn't over, and that everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, deserves respect and dignity. The police department's reform efforts were just the beginning. As the department began to implement new policies and undergo external audits, other cities and law enforcement agencies took notice. It was clear that changes needed to happen everywhere, and the woman's bravery had sparked a wave of reflection across the nation. People began to ask themselves how they could challenge their own biases and take steps to ensure they were treating everyone equally. For the woman, this incident marked a new chapter in her advocacy for racial justice. She wasn't simply content with the apologies she received or the changes that were being made in one police department. She continued to use her platform to call for a global rethinking of how people of color are treated by law enforcement, how bias affects every aspect of society, and how systems of power must be held accountable. As time passed, the woman's legacy grew. She wasn't just an ambassador for her country. She had become an ambassador for equality, dignity, and respect for all. Her actions had shown that sometimes the most powerful change begins with one person standing tall against injustice and refusing to let others determine their worth. The woman's experience was a pivotal moment, not only for her, but for the countless people who face judgment and discrimination every day. Her calm, dignified response to the police officer's mockery showed the world that standing up against injustice doesn't always require raising your voice. It requires the courage to be yourself and demand respect, even when others try to demean you. Her story is a reminder that every single one of us deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of our accent, skin color, or background. It's not just about one woman's victory. It's about the broader fight for equality and justice for all. The changes that followed were only the beginning. This moment sparked important conversations about systemic racism, police bias, and how society must confront these issues head-on. It was proof that real change starts with individuals speaking up, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it may be. Have you ever faced discrimination or been unfairly judged because of who you are? How did you handle it? We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Share them in the comments below. If this story inspired you, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about resilience, justice, and the fight for equality. Together, we can create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and respected. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that challenge assumptions and inspire change.